My partner refuses to share housework or recognize the slack I pick up. I work more than him. I earn more than him. I manage a chronic illness every single day. And when I finally just asked him, to pull his weight around the house, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're the messy one. You're putting all of this on me." And that was the moment I realized this wasn't about dirty dishes. This wasn't about whose turn it was to vacuum. This was about whether he actually respected me at all. If you've ever carried the whole weight of a relationship on your back, working full-time, managing your health, keeping the house running, while the person you love sits on the sofa and calls you the problem, hit like, subscribe, and stay right here, cause this story is going to hit somewhere deep, and I promise you it does not end the way you think. Let me take you back to the beginning. His name is Ethan, and 8 years ago, Ethan was my best friend in the entire world. We met in high school, junior year. He sat behind me in history class and used to pass me little folded notes with terrible jokes on them. The kind of guy who remembered your coffee order without being asked and showed up when things got hard. Genuinely one of the good ones. Or at least, that's what I believed. By the time we were 19, everyone around us had figured out what we were still pretending wasn't happening. We were crazy about each other, so we stopped pretending. We moved in together at 20 as roommates. 2 broke kids, 1 tiny apartment, a second-hand sofa that smelled a little weird no matter how many times we washed the cushion covers. It was loud and cramped and completely chaotic, and honestly, some of the best months of my life. A year later we made it official. Not just the relationship, the apartment. We got a slightly bigger place. Put our names on the lease together. Hung pictures on the walls. Felt like the start of something real. And for a while it was. Here's what you need to understand about Ethan before I go any further. He was the youngest child, the only son. Grew up in a house where his mom did everything. His laundry, his meals, his cleaning. He left for his first apartment at 22 and genuinely did not know how to use a washing machine. Not exaggerating. I showed him 3 times in the first month. I didn't hold that against him. I want to be clear about that. I didn't hold it against him at first, cause my childhood looked nothing like his. My mom worked 3 jobs. I'd come home from school to an empty house and a list of things that needed doing before she got back. I was cooking dinner by the time I was 11. I was doing the grocery run on Saturdays by the time I was 13. I raised my little sister Lily, packed her lunches, braided her hair, sat with her through homework while doing my own. Keeping a house running wasn't something I learned in a class. It was just survival. So when Ethan and I moved in together, I slipped into that role without even thinking about it. I knew what needed doing. I did it. He was grateful, genuinely, visibly grateful. He'd come up behind me while I was cooking and wrap his arms around me and say things like, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And I smiled every time he said it. Looking back now, I wish I'd paid more attention to what that sentence actually meant. Cause here's the thing about being capable, about being the person who just handles things. People get used to it. What starts as gratitude quietly shifts into expectation. And the moment that shift happens, you probably won't even notice, because capable people rarely do. We're too busy keeping everything running. The pattern started small. So small I genuinely didn't register it at first. Ethan would do something if I specifically asked him. Empty the bins if I said the words. Can you empty the bins? Wipe the counter if I handed him the cloth and pointed. But the noticing, seeing that something needed doing and just doing it, without being asked, without a reminder, without a prompt, that never happened. Not once. Not in 7 years. And I told myself that was fine. Lots of people need direction. Lots of people aren't naturally wired to notice domestic stuff. I can work with that. Asking isn't a big deal. So I asked every time, for everything. And every time I asked, I added another small weight to a scale I didn't realize was tipping. Then came the long COVID diagnosis. And everything got harder. I got sick about 2 years ago. What started as a rough week stretched into months of symptoms I couldn't shake. The kind of fatigue that doesn't respond to sleep, that sits in your bones like wet cement. Brain fog so thick that simple tasks felt like wading through mud. Days where getting dressed felt like an achievement worth celebrating. My doctor gave it a name. My body gave it a reality. And Ethan, to his absolute credit, was wonderful in those early weeks. He'd bring me water without being asked, check on me between meetings, tell me we'd figure it out together. I held on to that version of him like a lifeline. But chronic illness has a funny way of testing people. Not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet, ordinary Tuesday afternoon moments, when the novelty of caring has worn off and the symptoms are still there and life just keeps going regardless. And slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, Ethan's patience with my illness began to exist in a completely separate compartment from his expectations of me at home. He could look me in the eye and say, "I know you're exhausted, babe, I hear you," and then 30 minutes later leave his dishes in the sink and wander off to play video games, like two completely unconnected things, like they had nothing to do with each other. I want to paint you a picture of what a typical week looked like for me around 6 months ago. Monday through Friday, I was up before Ethan, dressed, and out the door for fieldwork. My job is in STEM, environmental research, outdoor sites, physically demanding in a way that would exhaust a healthy person. I was doing it with a body that staged a silent protest every single morning. Aching joints, foggy head, the kind of tired that coffee doesn't touch. Come home, make dinner, clean the kitchen, put on laundry because we'd be out of clean clothes by Thursday if I didn't. Notice the bathroom floor needed mopping and add it to the mental list I carried constantly at the back of my mind. The invisible running tab that I don't think Ethan even knew existed. And Ethan would come home, eat the food I made, say, "This is great, babe," and settle onto the sofa with his phone. And I said nothing. For months I said nothing. 'Cause I loved him. Because I didn't want every evening to turn into a negotiation. Because I kept telling myself it would shift, that he'd notice, that at some point the scales would just naturally balance themselves out. They didn't balance themselves out. I also need to say this clearly because it matters. I earn more than Ethan, significantly more. My career is further along, my title is higher, my hours are longer and more demanding. I am, by almost every measurable metric, the primary provider and the primary caretaker of our shared home. Not because I wanted to control everything, but because I showed up fully, consistently, and for a long time I showed up completely alone. About 6 months ago something shifted, and not for the better. Before that point, Ethan would at least do a specific task if I asked him directly. It wasn't proactive, it wasn't spontaneous, but it was something. I could say, "Can you vacuum before Claire comes over on Saturday?" And he'd do it. Imperfectly, maybe with some grumbling, but he'd do it. Then even that stopped. I'd ask him to take the bins out on collection day. He'd say, "Yeah, sure." Collection day would come and go and the bins would still be sitting there, full on the pavement. And when I'd mention it, he'd say, "You didn't remind me this morning." I didn't remind him, as if I was supposed to be his alarm system, as if it wasn't both of our bins, both of our responsibility, both of our mess. I started noticing a tightness in my chest every time I walked into a room and saw something that needed doing. That low-grade dread of knowing that the calculation was automatic now. If I don't do this, it won't get done. Not won't get done for a while. Won't get done, period. And then the reframe started. The victim takes. That's the part that really started to mess with my head. Because it wasn't just that Ethan wasn't helping. It was that when I raised it, he would somehow end up as the injured party in a conversation about my exhaustion. I'd say, "Ethan, I need more help around the house." And he'd say, "I feel like you're always criticizing me." I'd say, "I'm really struggling to keep up with everything right now." And he'd say, "I do things too, you just don't notice them." And the worst one, the one that I keep coming back to. I came home one evening after a brutal day on site. Symptoms were flaring badly. Joints aching, head pounding, the kind of exhaustion that makes the stairs feel like a mountain. I walked into the kitchen, and it looked exactly like I'd left it that morning. Dishes in the sink, crumbs on the counter, his jacket thrown over the back of the one chair I always kept clear. Ethan had been home for 6 hours. Half day. I didn't yell. I didn't slam anything. I stood in the doorway and I said very quietly, "Ethan, I really need you to pick up some slack. I am struggling." And he looked up from his phone and said, "You're the messy one, Claire. You leave everything to one day and then blame me when the place looks rough." One day. As if the laundry I'd done Tuesday didn't count. As if the bathroom I'd scrubbed Thursday didn't count. As if every meal, every grocery run, every quiet 10 minutes I spent wiping down surfaces before bed, none of it counted because he hadn't seen it. His reality was only built from what he witnessed. And most of my work happened in the margins of his attention. attention. My throat went tight. My eyes stung. I turned around and walked into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. And that's when the really uncomfortable questions started forming in my chest. Not why isn't he helping more, but does he actually see me? Not just the housework, my time, my energy, my body that is fighting something every single day just to keep going. Does he see any of it? I started paying closer attention after that, really watching, and what I noticed was this. Ethan was extraordinarily appreciative of labor he witnessed. If he happened to walk through the kitchen while I was cleaning, he'd say, "You're so good at this, I don't know how you do it." Warm, genuine, real. But what he didn't witness didn't register. It was like it didn't exist. My invisible labor was only real when it had an audience. Around this time I started talking to my friend Rachel about it. She'd been through something similar a few years back. Different relationship, same architecture. And she said something to me that I wrote down in my phone and have read probably 20 times since. She said, "Claire, someone who loves you doesn't get to keep saying they love you while consistently choosing their own comfort over your well-being. That's not love. That's convenience." I let that sit with me for a long time, because the hardest part wasn't that Ethan was cruel. He wasn't cruel. He was comfortable, completely, peacefully, obliviously comfortable in a life that I had built around him, maintained for him, protected for him, while he walked through it largely unaware of the infrastructure holding it all up. And comfortable people. Here's what I've learned. Comfortable people don't change unless something makes them genuinely uncomfortable. We had another conversation. Came prepared this time. Calm, no raised voice, specific examples. I sat down with him and I said, "I need you to really hear this. I am managing a disability. I am doing physically demanding field work. I am bringing home the majority of our income, and I am also doing the majority of everything in this flat. That is not fair, and it is not sustainable." He was quiet for a moment, and I actually thought something was landing. Then he said, "I feel like you keep score. Like whatever I do is never enough. It's exhausting, Claire." Exhausting. He said exhausting to me. The woman managing a chronic illness, doing field work in all weathers, paying the larger half of our bills, coming home to cook and clean and organize and maintain while he rested. He said it was exhausting to be held accountable for none of it. I walked out of that room and stood in the hallway with my back against the wall, and I just breathed in and out low, because if I didn't, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. And in that hallway, in that quiet, something crystallized for me. This wasn't a communication problem. This wasn't a chores problem. This was a respect problem. And the question I needed to answer wasn't how do I get him to help more. It was, how long am I willing to live like this? Now, I want to be honest with you here, because this story deserves honesty. I am not a perfect person. Can be messy. I can be scattered when my symptoms are bad. There are weeks where the flat gets behind and I feel guilty about it. I'm not claiming to be flawless, but there is a massive difference between messy and carrying the entire domestic load of 2 adults while managing a chronic illness. And Ethan had somehow convinced himself, and was trying to convince me, that those two things were the same. I did something after that conversation that I'm not entirely proud of, but I completely understand. I stopped doing certain things, not as punishment, as an experiment. I stopped wiping the stovetop after cooking, stopped replacing the toilet roll when it ran out, stopped clearing the table after dinner. Just stopped. And I waited. I wanted to see what would happen, whether he'd notice, whether he'd step in. Day 3, the stovetop was still unwiped. Day 5, there was an empty toilet roll tube sitting on the holder with a new roll just sitting on the cistern lid, because apparently getting it onto the holder was a step too far. Day 9, he walked past the table with the dishes from 2 days ago still on it, and said nothing. Day 14, 2 full weeks, he finally said something, and what he said was, "The place is looking a bit rough, babe." Not, "I'll sort that." Not, "Let me clean up today." Not, "I've noticed it's gotten behind, I'll take care of it." "The place is looking a bit rough, babe." Directed at me, like a complaint filed with the department responsible. I looked at him for a long moment, and very carefully, very calmly I said, "Yeah, it is." And I picked up my book and kept reading. The look on his face in that moment, the confusion, the slight indignation, like he'd never considered that the report could be declined. I wish I could tell you you that was the turning point, that he had a big realization right then and everything changed. But that's not what happened. What happened was he went and did the dishes. Grudgingly, loudly, with a lot of sighing. And when he finished he said, "Happy now?" And I said, "I wasn't unhappy before. The dishes just needed doing." More silence, more sighing. But the dishes were done. Over the next couple of weeks I kept pulling back. Stopped automatically filling the gaps. Stopped doing the mental labor of tracking what needed doing, and when just lived in the space, responded to my own needs, and waited to see whether he would start to see what I'd been doing all along. Some things he started picking up, slowly, imperfectly. Bins went out 1 week without me saying a word. He cooked dinner twice. Pasta both times a bit under-seasoned, but honestly, I almost cried at the table. Not because the pasta was good, because it was evidence. Evidence that he could do these things. That he wasn't incapable, wasn't hopeless, wasn't a lost cause. The capacity was always there. He just hadn't been required to use it. And that meant the problem was never about ability. It was about whether he respected my time and my body enough to try without being asked. We had the real conversation about 3 weeks after the experiment started. And I mean the real one. No tiptoeing, no softening, no managing his feelings before I'd even finished my sentence. I sat down across from him and I said, "Ethan, I need you to listen to me properly. Not to respond, not to defend yourself. Just listen." And for once, for the first time in what felt like a very long time, he did. I told him everything. The mental load I'd been carrying that he couldn't see. The way his victim-taking left me feeling like I was going crazy inside my own home. The way he'd say, "I know you're struggling," with his mouth while his actions said the complete opposite. The way his understanding of my illness seemed to vanish the exact moment it became inconvenient for him. I told him, "I don't actually need you, Ethan. I want to be with you. That is a different thing. But right now, this relationship is costing me more than it's giving me. And I can't keep spending from an account that never gets topped up." Silence. Long silence. And then he said, quietly, without the defensive pivot, without the wounded eyes, "I didn't see it. I genuinely didn't see it." And you know what? I believed him. I actually believed him. Not as an excuse, not as a get out, but as a real, uncomfortable, overdue admission that he had been blind to something that had been right in front of him for years. I said, "I know, but not seeing something doesn't mean it isn't real. And I need you to start looking." He nodded, slowly, and something in his face looked different, not fixed, not transformed overnight, but genuinely moved, like the words had reached somewhere they hadn't before. Here is where I have to be really honest with you about something, because I think it matters. That conversation didn't fix everything. There was no single movie moment where Ethan became a different person, and we lived happily ever after with a perfectly clean kitchen. That is not what happened. Real life is messier than that. No pun intended. What happened was slow and imperfect and sometimes frustrating. He'd have a good week and then slip back into old patterns, and I'd have to say something again. There were conversations that went sideways before they went anywhere useful. There were evenings where I sat with a familiar tight feeling in my chest and had to remind myself why I was still here, still trying, still believing this was worth the effort. But the direction was changing, and direction matters more than speed. About a month after that real conversation, something happened that I didn't expect at all. Ethan came home from work one evening and I was lying on the sofa with a heating pad on my joints. Bad symptom day, the kind where even holding a mug hurts. And without me saying a word, without me asking or hinting or leaving any kind of signal, he went into the kitchen. I heard the tap running, the clatter of pans, the sound of the fridge opening and closing. 40 minutes later he came in with dinner. Nothing fancy. Tinned tomato soup and toast, which is not exactly a Michelin star situation, but he'd made it, unprompted, because he noticed I was struggling and he did something about it. He put the bowl on the coffee table in front of me and sat down next to me and didn't say anything about it. Didn't make it a big deal. Didn't wait for praise. And I had to look away because I didn't want him to see me getting emotional over tinned soup. But that was it. That was the moment. Not because of the soup, because of what the soup meant. He had finally started looking. I also want to talk about the thing that nobody talks about when they tell these stories. The part that comes after the breakthrough. Because there's this assumption that once someone sees the problem, they fix it. And it doesn't work like that. Not really. Ethan seeing it was step one. Ethan changing was a whole separate process. And there were days when those two things felt very far apart. There was a week, about 6 weeks into us trying to do better, where I came home to a genuinely clean flat. Not just surface clean, actually clean. Bathrooms scrubbed, floors done, surfaces wiped, bins emptied. I walked in the door and just stood there for a second because the absence of mess felt almost strange. I called out to him and he was in the bedroom on his laptop. I said, "Did you clean the whole flat?" And he looked up and said, "Yeah, I had a day off. Seemed like a good time." Just like that. Seemed like a good time. Like it was normal. Like he'd always done it. I know that might sound like a small thing, but for anyone who has spent years carrying invisible domestic labor alone, you know exactly why I had to go into the bathroom and take 3 deep breaths before I could respond. Not because I was upset, because I was genuinely, overwhelmingly relieved. That's what it feels like when something you've been fighting for finally, quietly happens. We still have hard weeks. I want to be upfront about that. The pattern is old, 8 years old, and old patterns don't dissolve overnight. There are still moments when I catch the familiar tightness starting to build, and I have to decide whether to say something or let it pass. And now I say something every time. I don't let it accumulate. I don't perform fine when I'm not fine. That's the thing that changed most, actually. Not just in him, me. Because here's what years of invisible labor does to you that I don't think gets talked about enough. Doesn't just make you tired. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you question whether your needs are reasonable. Whether you're asking for too much. Whether the problem is actually you. Too messy, too demanding, too sensitive, too incapable of just coping. Ethan never said those things outright. But the dynamics said them for him. Every time my labor went unnoticed, it said this doesn't count. Every time he took the victim, it said you're the problem. And I spent a long time half believing it. That is the part one I'm most angry about, if I'm being honest. Not the dishes, not the bins, not the unseasoned pasta or the toilet rolls. The way the dynamics slowly, quietly convinced me that I was unreasonable for wanting to be seen. I was not unreasonable. I was exhausted. And there is a difference. I also need to say something about the disability piece because I think it's important and I don't want to gloss over it. Long COVID is real. The fatigue is real. Pain is real. The cognitive fog is real. It is not laziness, and it is not exaggeration, and it does not come and go based on convenience. And when the person who claims to love and support you can hold your hand through a hard symptom day, and then expect you to carry the full domestic load the next morning, that is a form of disrespect, whether they intend it or not. Understanding someone's illness in words while ignoring it in action is not support. It is performance. Ethan and I have talked about this specifically, about how his support needs to be consistent, not selective. About how he can't claim to understand what I'm dealing with and then act like it disappears the moment housework enters the equation. That has been one of the harder conversations, but also one of the most important ones. And he's heard it. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, he's heard it. I also want to talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The economics of the situation. Because I think women especially are conditioned to downplay this piece. To be careful about bringing up money. To avoid making the person who earns less feel emasculated or inadequate. And I did that. For a long time I tiptoed around the fact that I earn more, work more, contribute more financially. Like acknowledging it out loud would be unkind. But here's the thing. When one person is carrying the financial weight and the domestic weight and managing a chronic illness, that is not just unfair, that is genuinely unsustainable. No human body is built to sustain that indefinitely. Mine certainly wasn't. And pretending otherwise, softening it, not naming it clearly, that just delays the reckoning. I named it, eventually, and it needed to be named. There's a version of this story where it ends with me packing a bag and leaving. I won't pretend I didn't think about it. In the worst weeks I absolutely thought about it. If the economy were different, if rent weren't what it is, if living alone were a realistic option right now, I think I might have made a different choice. And I don't think that would have been the wrong one. Sometimes leaving is the right answer. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is walk out of a dynamic that was never going to change. But here's where I landed for myself at this point in time. Ethan is not a bad person. He is a person who was raised in a way that made him blind to domestic labor, completely, genuinely blind to it, and who had that blindness enabled for 7 years by a partner who was too capable and too quiet about it for too long. That is fixable. It is not always fixed. but it is fixable. What I needed to know was whether he was willing to do the work when it was actually required of him, not when it was easy, when it was required. And the answer slowly has been yes. Not a perfect yes, not a cheerful, effortless, never needs reminding yes. Real yes, a work set yes, yes. And for now, for right now, in this chapter of our lives, that is enough to stay and see what we can build. If you're in a version of this story right now, if you are the one whose labor is invisible, whose illness is acknowledged on good days and forgotten on inconvenient ones, whose contributions disappear the second they stop being noticed, I want you to hear something. You are not asking for too much. You are not the difficult one. You are not unreasonable, ungrateful, or too sensitive. You are a person who has been doing the work of two. And the exhaustion you feel is accurate. It is not weakness. It is data. The moment I stopped asking, am I wrong to feel this way, and started asking, why am I the only one carrying this? That was the moment everything shifted. Not because Ethan changed overnight, but because I stopped making myself smaller to protect his comfort. Your needs are not a burden. Your time has value. Your body, especially a body fighting something every single day, deserves to come home to a space that doesn't immediately demand more from it. And if the person sharing that space with you cannot see that, you are allowed to make them see it. You are allowed to stop filling the gaps. You are allowed to let the bins overflow and the dishes pile up and the stovetop stay unwiped until the invisible becomes undeniably, unavoidably visible. You don't have to perform fine. You don't have to manage their feelings before your own. You don't have to carry the weight of two people and the emotional labor of protecting one person's ego from the truth. You just have to tell the truth clearly, without apology, and then see what they do with it. Some people will rise to it. Some people won't. But either way, you will finally know. And knowing, even when it's hard, is always better than carrying. I still have long COVID. That hasn't changed. Some days are still harder than others, and I still have mornings where getting dressed counts as an achievement. But I come home now to a space that feels shared. Not perfectly, not always, but genuinely shared in a way it never was before. And I've learned something about myself through all of this that I want to leave you with. Being capable is not the same as being responsible for everything. Being good at something is not the same as it being your job. And the fact that you can carry more doesn't mean you should be left to carry more. I was raised to keep things running, to notice what needed doing and do it without complaint, without acknowledgement, without a second thought. That was survival when I was 11 years old, keeping the house together for my mum. It should not have been my default setting in a partnership at 27. Know your worth, not the negotiated down, softened, apologetic version of your worth. The actual thing. The full, clear, I have been doing extraordinary things, quietly for years version of your worth. And then stop accepting less than it. Thanks for watching the full story. Like and subscribe for more real-life dramas.